You said that you were reading a lot of literature, and naturally being of 3 different identities, you were curious. I'm guessing you read a lot of this literature before you got into university?
Kind of in the midst of it, I would say. In the midst of it, because I think actually it was when I was in university that I went through a lot of different transformations. I went through, you could say, a religious transformation and like just becoming more conscious, as they say, becoming self-aware. I started to kind of the classic stuff like reading Malcolm X, reading Frantz Fanon, reading certain things, and it made me curious. And I think even before I went to uni, as I said, I started doing psychology A-level, and I was just, again, attracted to write all these theories explaining why people acted in different ways. I remember being really curious about attachment theory and going home and be like, Mum, which one am I? I was more curious about myself, first of all, to be honest. I want to understand all my traumas and messed up stuff. And then I was like, I want to be curious about other people. Through the uni experience and different things, I knew that I wanted to do something to do with helping people. But I felt like there was something missing in terms of what's the word? How does it look for people who look like me? And that is where I started to read about certain Black psychologists and the work they did and different things, and started, okay, how does this apply to people of color? And also I got involved with Islamic psychology stuff and reading about the history of people that have written about things to do with CBT and things like that for hundreds of years before what we are told, actually, in terms of the white Western man that invented this stuff. But actually, there's been a history of people talking about these things within the Islamic world, within the Black world. I think for me, it was trying to find a psychology that fitted more with me. Because in undergrad, it was just very, I don't know about you, Samira, but for me, it was just very generic, very like psychology is very colorblind and it's just scientific. There's not really a lot of acknowledgement about how it looks in different cultures and populations. And that's when, as I said, I was really curious even about Yoruba words, for example. And I was like, oh, how do we describe emotions in Yoruba compared to English? And does this impact how people look at mental health problems, for example? It was something I was really curious about.
Amazing. Wow. And one of these books that you were reading, you mentioned, was called The Psychosis of Whiteness.
Did I mention that today?
No, it wasn't today. It was previously when we were talking.
I think I referenced it, but I haven't fully read that book, but I was referencing it. Yeah, it's a book by Kane Day Andrews or something.
Kane Day Andrews, yes. You were looking at how psychology affects Black people. And first of all, you looked into psychology because you're interested in yourself and trying to discover yourself. And then the more you looked into it, the more you're like, there isn't much for people like me. And that led you down this road. You started reading and seeing more and being like, actually, psychology isn't all Western, even though it's portrayed as all the great psychologists are white people, Europeans, and this is where it all began. You're like, we've been doing this from before then. There's theory of it in Islamic culture. There's theory of it in Black culture. What are some of these books that you can recommend to the audience?
Also, any Black psychologists like work to follow. Obviously, you have to watch this space with Kother, who's going to be a doctor soon. But anybody else that comes to mind?
Yeah, there's a lot of really good people. There's someone called Naim Akbar, who I really like. He's a Black Muslim man and he is based in the States. He has lots of books. If someone writes Naim Akbar, they'll find him. But I love how he looks at mental illness from a very different perspective. The way he looks at mental illness is almost like how much someone strays from looking after their own. I'm going to explain that a bit more. He has these concepts, alien self-disorder, anti-self disorder, and things like that. In all those concepts, what he's trying to say is that if you are, let's say, you're a Black person, for example, and you're trying to assimilate to whiteness so much that you hate your own people and you're doing things to destroy your own community, you have a mental illness. That's what he would argue. That is not how we would think about it in a medicalized way, right? If you're doing something against your group, right, against what would be helpful for your community and for your collective, that from an African lens, you're doing something against the collective, you're not actually well. You need help.
Basically, Kemi Badnock isn't well.
No, yeah, definitely not. I think she's definitely well. I just love how he looks at the lens of what is mentally well from a completely different way. Because I think that it's not just about, when people think about mental health and mental illness, they usually think about it from a very different lens, not from like a social lens and how somebody's functioning in a collective and in their society, right? So, as I said, all the Nigerian politicians and all of that,
they're not well.
See them, they're not okay. Because why would you? But if you actually think about it, why would you do something? Okay, obviously we know the benefits where you enrich yourself, you enrich your family, but in the long term, you're driving your country into more poverty and more people, moving away the human resources from your country, more and more people. It is a psychosis in a sense. It is a delusion because you think you're helping yourself, but in the long term, you are destroying yourself and your own people, right? That is the lens that these Black psychologists look at mental illness through. And I think it's like a social critique as well, if you think about it. That is one of the people I really like. Another person I like is Dr. Joy DeGruy or something like that, which I hope I'm saying her name right. She has a book called like Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And I think that is just a very powerful language in a sense. And essentially what she's talking about is obviously within the African-American experience, how the experience of slavery, racism, and all the things that have happened has created certain issues. Instead of saying low self-esteem, for example, she uses the word vacant esteem, like believing basically yourself as a Black person to basically not be of any worth. So therefore, you might overcompensate. If we think about the typical rapper being very materialistic, getting a lot of women, you're overcompensating because you feel like there's something missing. You feel like you're not good enough, right?
Yeah,
So looking at these things, as I said, through a very different lens can be really, really powerful.
I have two things to say about that. The first one was when you said that the politicians are doing something against their own group. They're not well in the head. It's very true. They're very not well. I just wanted to reaffirm that they're not well because funny, I was actually speaking to my friend recently, the same friend that designed this. Sure. And he was telling me about how right now in Ghana, people aren't happy with the current leading president and everything in Ghana. And I was like, well, haven't you heard? I'm surprised you haven't heard about this. Things like people are complaining that I don't know what the problem is exactly because we'll go too deep into it because we're too busy getting ready to party. But I get it about the corruption thing. You're taking money, you're enriching yourself. But at what point is enough money enough? And if you are doing that to such an extent that the entire country is feeling it and seeing it and like unhappy with you, then it's highly disappointing. Where are you going to go afterwards? After you're finished in the office, in the term, are you just going to abandon the country and leave? Who's still going to remember you for what you did? If you're messing up the infrastructure, you're going to have to live within that infrastructure. Unless, like I said, you up and disappear. And Nigerians are really known for this. Like Nigerian presidents, they'll fly and leave the country to get healthcare because they messed up the healthcare in their own country. It's just ridiculous. Annoys me so much. The second thing that I was going to say that you mentioned and triggered something. The post-traumatic slave syndrome. Once again, conversation with the same friend. Whilst we were driving somewhere, we had another friend who had come from America. He's actually Spanish, but he's living in New York right now. And he came from there. Somebody asked the question, is it true that the African Americans and the Africans in America don't get along? And we were trying to discuss it and trying to figure out why that is. Me and my friend came to the conclusion that our cultures are so different because technically the African Americans, their culture was taken away from them. They had to form a new culture. And every time they try to form a culture towards something more positive, it would get destroyed. Black Wall Street, bomb that. You're trying to improve in this way, bomb that. But anytime they try to develop the culture into something negative, they get encouraged by the people in charge. Hip hop started off as a positive thing. They never used to say the N-word in hip hop. The first thing that said the N-word was, you know, those black exploitation movies that they were taking advantage of black people. And America really loved that. The whole of America, white people in America really loved that. But that was the first place that they started using the N-word frequently. And hip hop was supposed to be something for political change, fight the power. It was all this thing to build the community in a great way. And that would get shut down. But when it started being manipulated to be more about killing each other and doing all that kind of stuff, suddenly the white people were cool with it. Yeah, let's do this more. Yeah, let's create a beef, West Coast, East Coast. I feel for the African Americans because they were trying to create a culture under a people that really don't like them and didn't want them to grow and become anything. America as an institution, they had the FBI, they had all these things. They were looking down at the African Americans and they're like, we have to stop this. And they had had years of taxes by then. Same Europeans from Britain, Ireland, Scotland, anywhere in Europe, they're the same people. Like, oh, we're Americans now, but yeah, okay, fine. If you say so, but it's still the same people. You have all that knowledge of how to ruin people or how to build a good culture and how to build a bad culture.
To add to that, there's two things I wanted to say. Like the first thing you mentioned about the Nigerian politicians and stuff, I was just thinking about also, imagine like participating in something that is creating a sense of fear also in society, right? If you look at Nigeria, there's a lot of lack of trust, obviously lack of security. Most of the time when I hear conversations where let's say a Nigerian's telling another Nigerian something good, like, nah, are you sure? Is it true? Like, can it really, like, there's so much doubt if you tell somebody like something good is happening, or because there's so much there is a kind of it's permeated through the society. The impact of corruption and all these things is made people not trust each other. It's not made people not have that faith in each other. Within the whole society, you can say that has been infiltrated with that psychosis in a sense, because to have that cohesive society, you need to have trust in the state. And once that trust in the state has broken down, it impacts even on a, not just a macro level, but a micro level as well. Yeah. And in terms of the African American thing, it reminded me of a conversation I had with someone years ago. And this person was a Nigerian that had moved to the States. We were just talking about African Americans and different things. And I said, oh no, they deserve to be in prison longer because they're naturally criminals. So Adam said, what did you say? I was so shocked. They said,
well, who said that?
The Nigerian person that had moved to the States was saying that African Americans deserve to be in prison for long because Black people are naturally more criminal. I was like, what? I think part of it is also when people migrate to another country, people want to see who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. For example, within the UK, between, let's say, Jamaicans and Africans and things like that, because people are like, oh, they're not being treated well. They're seen as them. We don't want to be associated with them, right? Like, oh, we want to be the good immigrant. We don't want to be associated with African Americans because everyone else is telling us they're criminals. Or even within the UK, I've seen that amongst Africans and Caribbeans. Caribbeans are like the bad Black people. We don't want to be associated. Stay away from, there's a very typical like Nigerians, and I think things have improved.
Yeah, I think that typical thing that you're saying, you know how you said there's a very typical Nigerian thing? I don't think it's a typical Nigerian thing. I think it's just because of colonization. We've been brainwashed to believe the white people are so much better than us and like the white people are the best. The remnants of that is why that Nigerian will come here and believe everything the white people say.
I completely agree with you, and that's the thing. I think it's because, as you said, people, number one, when they go to a new environment, they want to survive, they want to thrive, right? They're like, this is not my land, and then you're told these are the bad people. So I need to assimilate more to whiteness, and that means distancing myself. As like I said, Naim Akbar would say, like that is almost like an anti-self disorder. You distance yourself from other Black people because you see that as pulling you down. And as you said, people have been so brainwashed that anything the white man says is true. Also, I don't know if this is true or not, but something I've heard from some Nigerian friends that have grown up in Nigeria is that a lot of them didn't really learn a lot of Black history growing up. They don't learn. So some of them told me the first time that they didn't even understand. Like they used to hear all these African Americans. They didn't actually understand what does that mean. These are people who were taken as slaves and what happened to them. It took them years. One of my friends was like, oh, like years later. Then she said, oh, we learned in Nigeria all the good things the white man, he built the trains, he built the bridge, he built this.